Welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's event, Will Productivity and Growth Return After the COVID-19 Crisis? I'm Nell Henderson, economics editor for the Wall Street Journal. At the Journal, we've spent what feels like a very long year writing about the pandemic's effects on the economy. There's been a lot of pain and a lot of progress, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about the path ahead. One big question is, how has the economy changed for good and for bad, and what changes are temporary and which will be more lasting? One thing we've seen in the US is a pickup in productivity. That's output per hour of labor for a variety of reasons. The prospects for future economic growth and rising living standards will depend in part on whether this will continue in the US and whether we could see similar increases in productivity in other economies. With us today are several renowned experts on these topics. We'll hear first from Jan Mischke, a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute and a lead author of its new report on productivity and growth. Jan is based in Zurich, and since 2010, he has led MGI's work on competitiveness and growth in Europe and its global work on infrastructure, construction, and real estate. Before joining MGI, Jan worked for a decade as a McKinsey consultant on many industries, including autos, financial services, and telecommunications. To discuss the report and the issues it raises, we have Robert J. Gordon, the Stanley G. Harris Professor in the Social Sciences at Northwestern University. Bob is well known for his work on unemployment, inflation, and labor productivity. He literally wrote the book on U.S. economic growth. And for more than 3 decades, he has been a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee, which determines the start and end dates for recessions in the U.S. We'll also hear from Professor Paul Mizen at the University of Nottingham. Professor Mizen is currently a professor of monetary economics and director of the Center for Finance, Credit, and Macroeconomics. He has wide interest in matters related to central banking, financial markets, corporate investment, and productivity, and he is currently a consultant to the Bank of England. And we'll hear from Rob Atkinson, president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is hosting this event. So thank you, Rob, for having us. The foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and educational institute focused on issues at the intersection of tech, innovation, and public policy. After Jan's presentation, I'll moderate a discussion among our panelists, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. If you want to ask a question, go to the event page and the Slido panel under the video, or go to the Slido link on the YouTube page. Also, to see Jan's presentation, go to the event description on the ITIF webpage or the YouTube description. So with that, let's jump right into it. Jan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Nell, for the introduction. And maybe to take it off from where you left it, the increase in productivity that we saw in the US over the last few quarters is actually not in itself so good news, because that mostly stems from a lot of people losing their jobs in sectors like hospitality and retail that tend to have a slightly lower productivity than average. So this is actually mostly a mixed effect that is not necessarily very sustainable. Now, the good news is that our research shows that there actually is a very substantiated opportunity for an acceleration in productivity growth by up to 1 full percentage point over the 5 to 10 years ahead, linked to firm response to the crisis. So, and that would be more than double the productivity growth rate we saw after the global financial crisis. So quite some acceleration, but it's not we can't put it into the bank account just yet. We see most of the activities that could boost productivity growth concentrated among large and leading firms. So we need to spread that more widely. And on the other hand, particularly in Europe, the fact that the firm response to the crisis is exacerbating structural demand gaps has not yet really been solved by respective policies. So if I go through some of the details behind, we actually looked at what is happening to potential supply or productivity growth a little bit in a dichotomy between, could it be a little bit of an age of low progress because there's all the sclerosis from government support and what have you, or could we really move towards much more dynamism and innovation? And we find some evidence for the latter. But then also, does this potential productivity growth also translate into actual growth meaning is there enough demand around for firms to make the requisite investments, to see the positive business cases for the innovations and for the most productive firms to gain market share. And this is where the picture is a little bit more mixed depending on the geographies. So on the supply side, we see a lot in our client work, positive actions by firms to work on their strategies, of course, all the shifts online, digitization and on steroids and so on. So we tried to get from this anecdotal evidence to slightly more systematic by doing a survey among 600 senior executives of large firms in Europe and the US. And we find some quite striking advances triggered by the pandemic. So the shift to digital channels increased by 60% for 60% of response. That's of course relatively well known. There's also a well-known shift, of course, to invest in remote working technology. So we actually asked participants to look at automation and technology outside of remote work. So really robotic process automation, AI, machinery, and so on. And we saw a full 20 percentage point uptick between the share of companies that grew investment in those areas in the 5 years prior to the pandemic versus in the 5 years after the pandemic. So full 75% is actually the number of firms that plans to increase investment in these areas 5 years out. Interestingly enough, also significant upticks in less talked about areas like reorganization and agility. There's just so much faster decision-making going on in firms right now than there was previously. And 70% of respondents say they will continue to do so and they will continue to accelerate. And more than a majority of firms also say they have increased innovation and operating model disruption due to the crisis and the lockdowns. So lots of positive developments, but what does it mean for productivity? To try to understand that, we actually looked at a number of sectors, 8 sectors across the economy, just showing or listing 4 here, to understand what's really going on and will that be good for productivity or bad or neutral? And we found overall a full percentage point in some of the more advanced in some of the sectors you see here, even more, up to 2 percentage points potential acceleration in productivity. And to give you some examples, in healthcare, for instance, the UK National Health Service saw increases in online consultations from 10 to 85% of all consultations. Not all of that will stick, but up to 20% could stick. And in discussions with our experts, we find this is likely to be significantly more productive, less loss in waiting times, faster triage to the right specialists, better and easier bank-end processing and digitalization, and over time then also, of course, moving into using digital technologies for help with the diagnostic. Maybe also interesting, a sector less talked about usually when it comes to productivity and digitization is construction. Construction has been a laggard in digitization as the least digitized industry, just ahead of agriculture and hunting for quite some time. Now, technologies like digital twins and building integration modeling have been around for, well, literally decades and have been looming large to actually make strong inroads in the sector. And they have started to recently pick up already before the crisis. But now during the crisis, actually, in a separate survey, 60% of construction executives we asked said they are accelerating the rollout of these digital technologies during the crisis and beyond, partially because of health and safety restrictions on sites. So they need to be much more planned. They need to actually link to their subcontractors with the right interfaces to make sure they show up at the right times and so on. So much more of that needed, but also simply in the spirit of never waste a good crisis. And that is also one of the reasons why a lot of, particularly the leading firms across the construction ecosystem, are now making up their strategic plans or already investing in modular and offsite construction, really revolutionizing where the sector is going. ICT is an interesting sector in that it directly can benefit from scale. So you see, of course, we are all using much more Netflix now. British Telecom, for instance, saw a 2.5-fold increase in the request for bandwidth upgrades. And all of these kind of upgrades and additional usage of platforms that can scale easily actually mean more revenues, more customer value, more GDP, without an equivalent increase in the number of workers or hours worked. And then, of course, well-known retail, the switch to e-commerce, based on the China example, some 6 percentage points of that shift, accelerated shift, could remain sticky, the leading online retailers being about 2x as productive as the leading offline ones, in addition to massive waves of warehouse automation, as well as more use of advanced analytics, also enabled by higher credit card usage now for payment. Now, is that a universal picture, or is it only the leading firms that are doing all this? And this is a bit of a complex slide, but we tried to analyze company data of 5,000 firms to get relatively short-term indicators of what's happening. And if you look at R&D, for instance, in the second row here, you see that 53% of firms that we analyzed increased their R&D spending in the first 3 quarters of 2020 compared to a year earlier. And this is significant. It's a high number. It's something that makes us optimistic, but it's also 14 percentage points less than in the year before. And if you look at the amount of increase in R&D investment, then 2/3 of the overall increase are derived only from large superstar firms with 10 billion or more in revenues and high profitability. So there is a little bit of a question on, is it very concentrated? But there's some reason to be optimistic, as particularly in the United States, actually on the lower end of the business spectrum, on the smaller end, the number of new business creations went up by 24% 2020 versus prior year. And the same is true in a few Northern European countries, while you see a complete collapse of new business creations in Southern Europe. So there the picture is likely to be much more dire. Now, last but not least, what about the demand side of the economy? If we have all this additional productivity, does it just translate into higher unemployment or into sluggish growth and sustained output gaps like we saw after the global financial crisis? Or will it actually lift the entire economy and really be visible as a strong boost to growth? And here on the structural side, there's some room to concern already pre-pandemic in terms of consumption and investment. Incomes were growing slowly and much more slowly than productivity. So median wages grew 19 percentage points less than productivity since 2000. And also investment in terms of capital intensity, so investment per worker, was at the lowest levels since World War II, already coming into the pandemic. During the pandemic, savings rates really skyrocketed, 9 percentage points of GDP in the US. Mostly high-income households no longer spending on the services of lower-income workers. And uncertainties went up massively. And that led, of course, to a decline in investment rates. And also looking forward, we see that the kind of actions at the firm level that I talked about, 60% of those are more focused at efficiency and reducing the number of hours worked than really driving the top line, driving revenues, driving revenue growth and value-added growth. So some reason to be concerned on the demand side, on the structural side, despite, of course, pent-up demand leading to an initial spike. But the good news is in the US, that demand problem is likely solved by the announcement of policies and the further policies being in discussion. That is much less clear in Europe. So where does that take us? What do we need to do to actually reap the rewards and get a productivity dividend? On the one hand, make sure, where that is not the case, that demand is growing, particularly on the investment side. And also firms can here simply just look ahead, think through, there might be a much more attractive growth scenario out there than we thought. So it might be worthwhile now to invest. But of course, also on the public side, more investment in areas that have been lagging, like infrastructure, sustainability, affordable housing, a number of things that can be done. Making sure median wages grow in line with productivity so that households have money to spend. But then importantly, also making sure all the kind of innovation and digitalization spreads through the full business economy to also smaller firms. So leading firms, superstar firms can make sure that they include the entire ecosystem in their innovation efforts and make sure that they actually provide a platform for smaller firms to innovate alongside them and on top of the platforms that they build, rather than actually trying to squeeze them out and competing with them. And of course, regulators can think about, do we have the right rules and regulations in place to be conducive to that kind of behavior? With that, thank you very much, and back to you, Nell.
Thank you, Jan. That is a really terrific analysis and very thought-provoking. Let's turn now to our panel. Professor Gordon, Bob, what are your thoughts on the report and the issues it raises?
Well, I'm going to put the report in perspective by talking primarily about how we got into the situation that we're in now. I'm going to talk only about the U.S. I'm going to talk mainly about the past 10 years, with a little bit at the end about the present, where I agree with Jan's diagnosis of what has been happening in 2020, and some thoughts about the future, which I think are really quite consistent with his. About the past, the great productivity optimist, Erik Brynjolfsson, who recently moved from MIT to Stanford, is quoted in congressional testimony in 2019 saying, quote, "I think with the right policies, AI, artificial intelligence, can be harnessed to make the next decade the best decade in US history." To show you how far that is from plausibility, go back to the best decade in American history and compare with what we've been doing over the past decade. The best decade for productivity in US history was the 1940s. Between 1940 and 1950, labor productivity growth at an annual rate was 4.0% per year. In contrast, in the 10 years ending in 2019, labor productivity growth was only 0.8% per year, only 1/5 as fast. That shows how far we have to go to match the best record of American history. Those numbers are for the total economy. For the more familiar non-farm business sector, over the last 10 years up to the end of 2019, productivity growth was 1.0%. But for manufacturing, which I'm going to emphasize for several reasons, productivity growth was only 0.1% from the beginning of 2010 to the end of 2019. The level of productivity in manufacturing was actually lower at the end of 2019 than it was at the beginning of 2010. And by contrast, in the decade ending in 2005, productivity growth in manufacturing was no less than 6% a year. Now, it's really important to emphasize this extremely stark slowdown in manufacturing productivity, because some skeptics say, oh, well, we're mismeasuring productivity. We're not giving credit for all of the free internet services that are being provided. But manufacturing is important because it's not producing free internet services, it's producing goods. And manufacturing is generally considered to have the best measured level of output and productivity in the economy. So if the best measured part of the economy is exhibiting that incredible slowdown from 6% to 0, we're in real trouble. So whatever you've heard about labor productivity growth in the US economy, it's far worse in manufacturing. What has happened to the fourth industrial revolution made up of robots and artificial intelligence? The number of robots in the United States doubled over the past decade, from about 150,000 to 300,000. According to MIT's Darren Acemoglu, each robot replaces 3 manufacturing workers. Now, how could we have all these robots and yet no productivity growth in manufacturing? It's simple. Robot investment is just not very important. Total investment in equipment in the US economy runs at $1 trillion a year. How much investment in robots per year? $6 billion, less than 1%. So not only is robot investment unimportant and almost invisible for the economy as a whole, but robots are just not very good at replacing humans. They must be pre-programmed to do specific tasks. They lack judgment. They notably lack dexterity and the ability to react to unexpected events. What about artificial intelligence? The CEO of Google, Mr. Pinchal, has stated that AI will be more important than fire or electricity. Well, I ask the citizens of Texas whether AI is more important than electricity, given their experience in February. AI is also unimportant. Remember that figure of $1 trillion for total US equipment investment in producers' durable equipment? Total worldwide AI spending is only $35 billion. Most applications of AI so far are in pattern recognition, facial recognition, voice recognition, other types of patterns. Amazon telling you what books you'd like to read next. AI is based on deep learning because it is called deep, using multiple layers to link inputs like multiple cat images with the resulting conclusion. This is a white cat. This is not akin to human intelligence. It's more like conditioning and training an animal. AI is less of a general purpose technology than computers because computers can do many things, whereas AI requires skilled engineers to custom build each application and each new set of data. The problems in developing autonomous vehicles provide an example of the limitations of AI. Autonomous vehicles are always just around the corner, and just around the corner, the other day, we had yet another crash of a Tesla autonomous vehicle. Let's move from the past to the present. What's happening to labor productivity over the past year? After growing at 1% in the 2 years up to the end of 2019, US labor productivity for the total economy in the 4 quarters of 2020 jumped to 2.6%. Are the roaring 20s at hand? Well, not so fast. And here I want to reinforce what Jan said. A notable fact of this pandemic was to reduce low-paid jobs in close contact industries, while high-wage workers kept their jobs while working at home. To see the impact of this mix effect, look at average hourly earnings. After growing at a steady 3% in 2018 and 2019, in the 4 quarters of 2020, average hourly earnings growth jumped to 4.7% a year. Not because everyone suddenly got a raise, but because of the mix effect, the composition effect. What about the future? The consensus forecast is that growth in the 2nd and 3rd quarter of this year are going to be the fastest since 1983 and 1984, something like 6 to 8% annual rate in each of the next 2 quarters. So let's look back to 1983 and 84 to see what happened then to productivity. The growth of GDP in the 8 quarters after the trough of the 1982 recession was 6.5% per year, faster than anybody is predicting for the next 2 years. 2 quarters maybe we're going to get, but not 2 years as we had back then. How did productivity do in those 8 quarters of 1983 to 84? It grew at 2.5%, about a point faster than the trend that turned out to be true in the 1980s. Over the longer run, in the decade of the 2020s, I've been quoted by the Wall Street Journal as suggesting that productivity growth could be as fast as 1.8% per year, compared to, for the non-farm business sector, only about 1% a year over the last decade. Why am I suddenly so optimistic? The main reason is bounce back. Because productivity growth was so slow over the decade of the teens, and because 6 years ago I predicted productivity growth for the total for the non-farm business sector to be roughly 1.5%. I think we're going to make up some of the lost achievement. And just as the Fed is going to allow inflation to rise above its target because it's been below target for so long, I think we're going to observe productivity growing faster than my earlier forecast, just because it's been so low for so long.
That's a lot that we're going to want to follow up on. But first, let's turn next to Professor Mizen. Paul, what do you think about all this?
Thank you, Nell. So I'm going to share some slides, which I hope you can see. And I'm going to talk mostly about the UK and the US experience, drawing on two surveys that have been conducted over the last 5 years. The Decision Maker Panel, which is organised by the Bank of England and a group of academics, and then the Survey of Business Uncertainty, which is run by the Federal Reserve in Atlanta. So to set the scene, as we've already seen, COVID has been a huge shock that has impacted the economy, but we can learn a great deal from it. And this chart here, which is a combination of the two surveys, the Business Uncertainty and the Decision Maker Panel survey, shows how much sales uncertainty has increased. It's essentially doubled in both the UK and the US since the COVID crisis. So it's one of the largest shocks to hit business in recent decades, much bigger than the global financial crisis. And it impacted, first of all, in the East and moved to the West. And by the second quarter, it hit a peak, as you can see from this slide here. But it didn't hit every business the same way. So here's a distribution of future sales growth that firms report in the respective surveys. So on the left-hand side, you have US future sales growth, and on the right-hand side, UK future sales growth. And what you see is that there are some firms that will benefit from COVID. The demand for their products is going to increase, and their sales growth is therefore expected to rise relative to what it would previously have been. But there are many firms for which COVID is a real negative shock. And while the spread increases, the downside is much larger than the upsides. And that's true in the UK and in the US. So both countries have experienced the same kind of shock. Now, to reinforce that point about the asymmetric effects, here's a slide which shows the impact of COVID on sales in the UK across different sectors during 2020 Q2. And we've organized the data here to show different types of sectors by the types of customers that they serve, the kinds of businesses that they are. So the highly consumer-facing services are massively hit. Recreational services, accommodation and food, transport, non-food retail is all really badly hit, and you can see that in the red lines, where the sales fell by as much as 75%. When you look at essential services, you see a very different story. Essentially, health, utilities, food manufacturing and wholesaling, agriculture and so on were carrying on with a hit, but not anything like as large as a hit as the consumer-facing services. And then you have firms that are in between. So there's quite a distribution here in terms of the impact of the crisis and the effects, which we'll go on to see. So how has this affected the response of business? One thing that's occurred is that many firms have sent their workers home. They've simply said, okay, you can't work on the premises, so you're going to have to work at home. And others, in this context, we're talking about the UK, have sent them on to a furlough scheme. The furlough is a UK government scheme which pays for 80% of the wages of the workers who are furloughed. And you can see that according to the sector in which the businesses operate, you get very different responses to working from home, working on the business premises, or taking up this furlough scheme. The furlough scheme is taken up by sectors like accommodation and food, and retail, and other sectors which are impacted by COVID to a larger degree. The sectors that don't use furlough very much are those that are able to work from home a great deal, like professional and scientific, finance and insurance. So there's a very different response here. But let's ask the question, those people who are working from home, how productive are they? How much output are they actually producing? So we can have a look and see what impact that has on output and productivity. Well, the first thing to say is that the firms that have been impacted the hardest are the ones that are the lowest productivity sectors. So recreation services and accommodation food, if you rank them by their 2018 productivity in terms of output per job, then they're at the lowest end. And those are the firms that have tended to reduce their hours and take up the furlough scheme rather than send people to work from home. On the other hand, the companies which are able to work from home are the more productive ones, like the finance and insurance and information and communication sectors. So what's the net effect? Well, these are UK data, and they're drawn from the Decision Maker Panel survey. But what we find is that productivity has dropped in aggregate over the period of the pandemic. And that's partly because firms have had to pay more in order to produce the output at work. They've had to pay for screens, they've had to pay for protective equipment, they've had to distance their workers. But also, productivity has risen a bit because the low productivity firms have dropped out of the calculation. So by a batting average calculation, the higher productivity firms have a greater weight, and therefore that raises productivity a bit. And the net effect, if we're looking at TFP, is to reduce productivity. If we look at labour productivity, it slightly increases productivity, but then over the long run, looks to be about the same. If we look at the impact across the whole of the UK, across all sectors, then essentially what's happened here is that unit costs have increased, which has increased reduced the productivity, and sales has fallen, and so has hours. So in effect, what's happened is that the hours of those less productive workers has dropped more than the hours of the more productive workers. And even though sales have fallen, they haven't fallen by as much as hours. So awful as this has been, it would have been much worse if it hadn't been for the fact that we could work from home and make use of what we call potential capital. And we're going to define potential capital as the capital that can be utilized at home for productive purposes. So residential dwellings that have been repurposed for work. So you can think of somebody like an Uber driver who uses his car to transport people around, but it's his car and he uses it for his own personal transport as well. But he's repurposing it sometimes for work use, and also the internet. Now, that potential capital is unlocked by the fact that people work from home and make use of their capital at home and make use of the internet. And this has led to an increase in output that wouldn't otherwise be there. It's prevented output from falling by as much as it would have done otherwise. So the pandemic in some ways has solved the collective action problem. Everybody had to work from home, and we've now been able to observe what effects that has, and we can see how it's impacted on productivity. So let's just have a quick look at some figures. Here are some figures for the UK and the US. And what I want to focus on are the bar charts on the right, because essentially what you can see is that during that critical quarter of 2020 Q2, when output at work fell by 19.1% in the UK and by 17.4% in the US, there was an offsetting effect of work from home, which is shown by the red bar. So in the UK, the work from home contributed 13.8% of output, and in the US, 9%. And this is the difference between those two numbers is essentially down to the composition of the economies. The UK is a more service-focused economy that is more suitable for working from home. But you can see the offsetting effects there in that critical quarter. If we then start looking at winners and losers, we find that sectors like information and communications, finance and insurance had massive contributions. Again, the red bars on the right-hand side, due to output produced at home. Whereas the losers, which were accommodation and food, wholesale and retail, had almost none. So working from home is likely to persist. These are the responses to a survey which asked firms how likely they are to continue using working from home arrangements. So what are the effects likely to be? Well, whether it's going to reverse or not depends on what caused it. If it's purely down to the costs, the relative prices of working from home or working from work, then it's likely to reverse, at least partially. If it's down to overcoming the collective action problem, well, we've done that, so it's likely to persist. And if it's about learning how to do the working from home efficiently, again, we've understood how to do that, and that will persist. So we think that there are gains to productivity and output that arise from the use of potential capital, and these have been unlocked by working from home. And the contributions are quite large, although they're not going to fall into all sectors. They're going to be apparent in some sectors and not so apparent in others. And the final part of our question, which we were asked to consider, is, well, what should governments do to support or cushion these effects? Well, encourage employees to invest in potential capital by offering tax deductions where possible, support the resilience that this provides to the economy by upgrading internet and offering training and education in IT skills, and support the trends that have been accelerated and cushion the effects on sectors that are impacted. Okay, back to you, Nell.
Great. All right. Thank you, Paul. All very, very interesting. Let's now hear from our host, Rob Atkinson. Rob, what would you like to add before we move on?
All right. Well, thank you. Nell, thank you for hosting us today. And Jan, thank you for that great report. It was very interesting. I always appreciate MGI reports because I find them very compelling and interesting, and you explain the information quite well. What I thought, one of the things I thought was very good about your report was the productivity analysis is a little bit like Goldilocks, and Bob rightly pointed out that some people out there who are, I mean, you want to call them too soft, everything's going to be great. We're in the fourth industrial revolution, or AI is bigger than fire. That doesn't do us any good. In fact, it makes things worse because it has led to a panic. If AI is bigger than fire, then we're all going to be out of work, and according to Elon Musk, we're all going to be dead by the killer robots. So I think that's important to sort of say what's really likely going to happen. And it's not revolutionary by any stretch of the imagination. It's incremental, but everything helps, particularly when we've had 15 years or so of slow productivity growth and slow wage growth and slow income growth. One of the things I thought was interesting about the report, and also what Paul just alluded to, is the pandemic, to me, just highlighted again how serious market failures are. Everybody assumes that firms do things that are maximizing their own economic welfare, but there are coordination problems that are rampant, and the pandemic was one of those. We all could have been working from home. We all could have been doing these kind of Zoom calls, but we weren't, because the norm was you're not supposed to do that. Now that took a massive pandemic and shutdown of the economies to make that a reality, even though the technology was there certainly for the last maybe 3 to 4 years. So in that sense, economic shocks can be pretty important, because they can move economies in ways that are optimal, even though sort of the market ideologists, the market fundamentalists would say, no, market outcomes are optimal. This is why Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said last year that we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. Well, if we saw 2 years in 2 months, and we should have seen that before. There was no reason not to see 2 years in 2 months. It sort of forced the shock, was what created it. And as Jan noted, there are other issues that are on the table. You may mention construction, which at least in the US is one of the industries that's had, at least according to the BLS, measured negative productivity growth over the last 30 years. And one of the challenges there is not that the technology doesn't exist to raise productivity. It does. National Academies did a big study on that. It's the coordination failures. If you're going to transform the construction system, everybody has to be playing a role. The suppliers, the material the users, the building designers, et cetera. And that doesn't happen naturally. One of the reasons I'm more optimistic maybe than Bob is because I do think that technology matters. And I wrote a book, I guess 15 years ago, called The Past and Future of America's Economy. And it was really taking a Schumpeterian long wave approach. In other words, Joseph Schumpeter argued that technology isn't just this linear process. It doesn't just kind of go up. It actually goes in cycles, and these cycles are 40 to 50 years long. And so that's why I think everybody's been, waiting, as Bob said, where is, we have the robots, and Bob said, what happened to the so-called fourth industrial revolution? That to me is a pretty important question. And to me, I'm not at all disturbed or worried that the fact that we haven't seen the productivity event results in it, a little bit like Bob Solow in 1988, maybe saying we have computers, we see them everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, you would not be able to use a 1988 computer for anything. I mean, they were not very good. They weren't connected to the internet. They weren't using Windows. They were terrible machines. It took another 5-8 years to build that system up. And I think that's frankly where we are with the quote, fourth industrial revolution, technologies around autonomous systems, smart systems, AI, 5G, robotic process automation, and the like. They're getting better, but they're not quite there yet. And so I'm certainly less skeptical than Bob that they're more than just cat videos. I think they're more important than that, but they're also not better than fire. One of the things I thought was interesting about the report is it talked about the compositional effect on productivity. In particular, large superstar firms didn't lose revenue where everybody else lost revenue. Large superstar firms invested more in R&D. And the political climate in the US now would look at that fact and with a lot of trepidation, particularly the neo-Brandisians would say, oh, this is terrible. And yet, economists who had been at the U.S. Census Bureau, Center for Economic Study, Foster, Haltewanger, and Kreisen did a study a decade ago or so, and they found that in U.S. manufacturing, 25% of productivity growth was from reallocation. In other words, more productive firms taking market share from less productive firms. And in retail, it was 90%. So this kind of, if you will, weeding out the zombie firms or the less productive firms by large firms who are high performers, that's something we ought to be welcoming as long as they don't go into monopoly levels of concentration ratios, which there's no evidence of that right now. So I think that's a real plus. And to me, that's one of the things that a shock can do. It historically, the famous line from Mellon in the Great Depression, purge the weak, and obviously an insensitive view, but the view behind that is that in recessions like we're in now, or we were in, it does force the weaker companies out of the marketplace and allows more productive firms to take their place. I think one last part on that, though, is that while labor productivity, I think, could be strong, I think total factor productivity might have problems, largely because of the large number of assets that are going to be unutilized. We're going to have shopping malls that are unutilized. We see that now. Airplanes that are unutilized, hotels, office buildings. And I don't think the office market in most cities is going to come back anytime soon. I think people are going to, quote, hotel, share spaces with workers. And while that's great for labor productivity, it's problematic for TFP. Just a couple of last sort of maybe nits or criticism. Maybe there was a part in the report, Jan, where you said accelerating superstar effects could lead to further rises of income inequality. For instance, if the labor share of income falls further. I guess I disagree with that. I don't think there's any evidence that superstar firms are causing income inequality. That's mostly almost all due to high income individuals in the top 10% or even 1% of the income scale. And the fall in labor share of income is almost all due to the rise of housing income. It has nothing to do with profits or monopoly or anything like that. There's a report we did looking at BEA data on that. I guess also, I'm more optimistic about firms focusing on the bottom line. One of the problems with firms focusing on the top line is that can have two different effects. If they're focusing on the top line only to gain market share from other firms, is little bit like one firm benefits, one firm loses. So what? Ford sells a little bit more, and Toyota sells a little bit less. But bottom line innovations and changes raise the overall capability of the economy to produce more. Last point I'll just make, and that's since we are in Washington and we're a policy think tank, I do think there's a lot of, and you talked about this, Jan, at the end, a lot of important policy implications. And to me, the one most relevant right now is as Congress considers a big infrastructure bill or a related bill around the China bill, which would include investments in innovation and R&D. I think it's super important that we make sure that that infrastructure bill and the China bill include investments that are going to drive productivity. For example, most of the investments that people talk about in that bill for highways are going to do nothing to raise productivity. They'll repave roads. Look, reality is that doesn't, economists show, and that doesn't do anything to raise productivity. But if we invested in broadband, if we invested in smart cities, got the federal government to move to the cloud, a whole set of things like that around digital technologies that, in our view, and when you look at the evidence, would have a big impact on productivity. So I think what Congress does in the next 2 to 3 months could also have a big impact on where we're going to be in 5 years. So with that, thank you. I'll stop there.
Really interesting points, and I'd really like to come back to the later to the point you just made on infrastructure investments. But you all made a lot of interesting points I want to follow up on. Just drill down a little bit on some of your points. Let's start with the divergence between the U.S. and Europe. Why did we see so much more productivity growth in the U.S. than Europe during the pandemic? Was it really just creative destruction and mix effect of the U.S. that is that, as you say, the superstar firms, the big firms could just crush it. I mean, not crush the little ones, but they have the size, they have the scale, they can make the investments, they could go digital, they have the access to capital, much more. Home Depot is much better positioned to survive the pandemic and make the gains we're talking about than your corner hardware store. And you can see that across a lot of different industries. And is it just that the little firms that went out, smaller businesses went out of business more in the U.S. and more low-income jobs were allowed to be, eliminated in the U.S. compared with Europe, where the policies are more oriented towards firm and job preservation? And if that's my rough understanding, if that's the case, is there any reason to expect that to change in the future? Once this is over, why would you not see that those trends continue in Europe and in the U.S.? Why don't we start with Paul, and then we'll go to Jan.
Thank you. Now, sorry. So I think there is a lot in what you say. So the composition effects I think are really important. So I think in Europe there were schemes to protect businesses and also protect jobs, and that meant that it was possible for workers to continue with their relationship with their employers and in certain sectors to carry on producing output. And in the UK context, that meant that many service-orientated firms were able to continue to provide services, provided it wasn't in-person services. So they were able to carry on, and that possibly increased the productivity. And I think also this issue about the really low productivity sectors just dropped out of the calculation. They just didn't produce because their premises were closed or they weren't able to offer the services.
And Jan, what do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't over-index on what happened to the numbers in 2020. I think at the peak of such recessions, all kinds of technical almost effects happen, and it's a repeated pattern where also after the global financial crisis, U.S. productivity went up because a lot of layoffs happened at the low end of the wage spectrum, and in Europe it tanked because those layoffs did not happen. But that doesn't necessarily have so much bearing for the longer run. What is interesting though is that when we look at what is happening among the large or leading firms, the responses we get in our survey, both sides of the Atlantic, the kind of accelerations and so on are almost identical. So we don't see much difference on that dimension, and in that sense also not much difference necessarily in terms of the potential for acceleration. What makes me more concerned is that in many European countries, the small business sector matters so much more because there are less large firms to go around, and also I think you mentioned it, Bob, that a good share, was it 15 or so percent of productivity growth is driven essentially by between firm effects, small firms being weeded out, and that might happen much less in Europe.
So Paul and Jan, do you see much chance for European productivity to pick up a lot in the future?
I can start. I would still be relatively optimistic as it regards like larger leading firms in Europe. And we see a few countries, particularly in Northern Europe, where also business dynamism seems to be holding up okay-ish. But I am personally somewhat worried about an increasing dispersion yet further between Europe's North and Europe's South.
Yeah, I can see that. Bob, did you want to jump in on that? I saw you nodding.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something that is first order importance in distinguishing the U.S. experience from Europe, and that is the much larger scale of the fiscal stimulus in the U.S. So you have GDP in the goods sector has actually not declined. It did briefly in the second and third quarter, but spending on goods is back, if anything, higher than it was before the pandemic. And so not only Home Depot, but also your neighborhood hardware store is getting a great flood of spending on home improvement with all of this federal government stimulus money. And now we've gone into even greater amplitude of fiscal stimulus with the $900 billion at the end of December plus the $1.9 billion much more recently. So there's no prediction for Europe that we're going to have anything like the enormous growth rate of the U.S. economy that is projected for the next most of the next year. That's going to pull some productivity with it. One thing I didn't mention is that we have a much discussed labor shortage in much of the U.S. Restaurants can't find cooks. Much of this is related to the fact that women had to drop out of the labor force to take care of children who were home from school. So until the school system gets fully back in operation and these women are able to move back from in-home to the service kinds of jobs that they previously occupied, we're going to have, I think, a rather artificial stimulus to productivity as business firms struggle to produce with inadequate supplies of labor. I don't see anything like that happening in Europe.
And Rob, did you want to add anything to this? Are we just sort of seeing a more what you call weeding out in the U.S. than in Europe?
Yeah, no, I think we are. I wrote a book with my colleague Mike Lind about 2 years ago for MIT Press called Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. And there's very good data from the European Commission that shows almost a complete linear relationship between firm size and productivity in Europe. Small firms, very low productivity, large firms controlling for industry. And the Europeans protect the small firms a lot more than we do. Tax and regulatory burdens are a lot lighter. A number of economists have looked at that. So I don't see that changing. And I think, Jan, your point about Europe needs the small, it's sort of like they're locked in this thing. They've made themselves so dependent upon small business that now they can't get out of it. They're like, oh, we're afraid. And at some point you just got to bite the bullet and say, all right, we're going to allow a little bit of creative destruction to happen and get larger or at least mid-sized firms that can get scale, particularly in using digital technologies.
All right, we could go down that path, I think, for a long time. Let me pull it back to a couple other topics, just so we can cover more ground. I love, of course, the historical comparisons in the McKinsey report. So I really wanted to ask Bob, can you explain to us why the U.S. and European productivity growth was so strong in that kind of golden period between World War II and the 70s, and then pretty lousy ever since, except for that brief period in the 90s. And do you see our current situation as similar or different from that post-war golden age?
Well, I've written 2 articles on exactly that topic, comparing Western Europe with the United States. Divide up the post-war into 4 eras. After the war, up through 1972, Europe grew much faster than the U.S., and that reflected all of the great inventions that were implemented in the U.S. during the interwar period and during World War II, whereas Europe faced chaos and destruction. So up to 1972, Europe was catching up and showed much faster productivity growth. In the interim period after 1972 up to 1995, the U.S. fell back down to about 1.5% per year. And Europe proceeded sort of doing an imitation of the U.S. 20 years later. Then after 1995, that's the great mystery. The U.S. had productivity revival. It makes a lot of sense following up on what we've heard. The computers of the late 80s were not very good. Finally, the computers got to be really good in the 1990s and up through 2005 with flat screens, internet connections, and we got rid of the typewriter and filing cabinets. All that made a huge difference in the level of business productivity in the United States, and somewhat mysteriously also in manufacturing, which isn't affected by the personal computer and the internet in anything like the same way. So the big mystery is why Europe did not imitate that effect of the computer revolution between 1995 and 2005 and suffered slow productivity growth. After 2005, for the last 15 years, it's pretty dismal on both sides of the Atlantic. We've got slow productivity growth of less than 1% in the total economy for the last decade in both places. So as of the end of 2019, Europe and the US are starting off from the same place. But I think we're going to see much more productivity growth in the US, partly because all of this federal stimulus money is just going to stretch the ability of the economy to supply output with, as I said, some of the female supply of workers, at least temporarily, at home.
Actually, can I ask, Jan, you looked at the historical comparisons. Do you see our current situation as more similar or different from that post-World War II golden age?
Yeah, it's, I mean, we haven't been in a war now, so also the period after this crisis will be quite different from the war. There will not be a reconstruction boom. But I think the one similarity in the US might be indeed the strength of demand that Bob already mentioned, and that is kind of much less clear in Europe. And I think the second, I'm also not sure whether the productivity drivers were would be so similar, because this time around not so much about catch-up growth, also as we saw it in Europe after the war. This is really about digital technologies and innovations really kind of being adopted much more broadly. So this is not so much like the cutting edge. This is like existing technologies and innovations like online commerce. We've had it for like 20 years, and it's still only got to like 20% share of total retail, and might go to 25 or to 30 or so coming out of the crisis. That's a big jump, and it makes a difference, but it's really like scale up of well-known technologies and innovations.
Your scenario analysis, which is so MGI, I love it. Do you see it as unlikely that we're going to go into that upper right-hand quadrant of another golden age? Or are you expecting something less than that?
So the first half of your question was missing, but is it kind of That was whether we are kind of ready to go into that.
Do you want me to repeat it? No, you don't have to put it back up on the screen. I'll remind people that a classic McKinsey Global Institute scenario analysis, there are 4 quadrants, and the upper right-hand quadrant is the best possible outcome. I guess on your screen it'd be up here. And that would be a repeat of the post-World War II rapid growth scenario. So I'm interested, does anybody on the panel think we're headed for another golden age like that, or are you all expecting something a bit less? Jan, you want to start?
Well, as I said, I think we're very likely to have productivity growth revive somewhat from the dismal experience of the last decade, and look something more like what happened in the United States in the 70s and 80s, when, after all, there was a lot of innovation and a lot of transition brought about by the computer age. What I don't see is a return to 3% plus productivity growth that we enjoyed back before 1970, and that we enjoyed also in the United States in the late 90s and early 00s. I wanted to add something that was very interesting, this idea of people working at home and utilizing home capital. Think of the heating of a house. It goes on anyway, all day long, even though the occupants of the house may be in a downtown office building. So all that heat is being wasted at home. Now, people are working at home, and that heating is raising productivity, essentially, instead of being idle. What we have to take account of, though, which is a medium-term transition effect, is all of the heating of the downtown office buildings that's being wasted. We're going to have wasted resources, not only in downtown office buildings, but in all the support industries that exist downtown: restaurants, convenience stores. Think of the reduced utilization of public transit. To the extent that public transit agencies can afford to do so, they'll maintain the current level of service, but they're going to have only half as many riders. So it's going to take a while to even understand how that's going to sort out for total economy productivity when you have so many parts of the traditional downtown economy operating at much reduced utilization.
Right. And Paul, did you want to add anything on this before we move on?
Perhaps I can come in on that. So I think one of the critical things, I think we've learned quite a lot about how to work from home productively, and we've realized that we've got productive capital at home that can be utilized. I mean, some general purpose technology like the internet and the computers, which can be used for many things. Whether we end up scrapping, as it were, or underutilizing other capital depends to an extent on how far we go with working from home. Do we go 100% from working from home, or do we end up with some kind of hybrid model where we're working from home at some point in the week and we're working in the office at others? And maybe we're finding out which of those tasks we can do from home most efficiently and which tasks we can do in the office most efficiently. If that's the case, then we may be using less equipment in the city centres. We may not need as much office space, but at the same time, the capacity of our existing infrastructure is going to be sufficient. We won't need to worry about the fact that we have delays because the trains and the highways are all crowded with many people all trying to get in to work at the same time. So I think there are these gains that we're going to observe, and perhaps the losses are not going to be so huge.
Can I just add one quick point on that, which is one of the problems with productivity statistics is they don't count personal non-employment work. And so if I go out and if I buy a restaurant meal, it's counted as output. If I make my own meal, it's not. Mike Mandel at the Progressive Policy Institute has shown that Amazon, I think it's Amazon, it might be e-commerce in general, but we're talking millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of hours saved because they don't have to go, people don't have to go. I live in Bethesda, so I don't have to slock up Rockville Pike and deal with all the traffic. Same thing with people working at home. You don't have to commute. If we count that into output and savings, then definitely those are going to be productivity gains.
Yeah, I would say so. let's move on a little bit. One thing I really wanted to ask about is long-standing structural drags that existed before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we were suffering for a long time from this global malaise of slow growth, low interest rates, low inflation in developed economies. This has been attributed to many factors, including aging, excessive savings over investment demand, technology, globalization. You know well how Larry Summers warned of secular stagnation. Why would those forces go away now? Just because some companies are investing a little bit more in digitization and ramping up their processes. Should we expect these forces to reassert themselves after the pandemic and the short-term stimulus passes? Who wants to jump in on that? How about Bob? Bob, what do you think?
Well, first place, I think that Larry Summers on secular stagnation ignored the supply side and focused exclusively on the demand side. We had very slow growth in the United States in the Obama era coming out of the financial crisis, in large part because of a philosophy of fiscal stringency, the so-called sequester of government spending, together with a very tight budgets at the level of state and local government. On top of that, we had this productivity slowdown that we've been talking about today, and you put them together, and you had this very poor period of GDP growth of around 2% and GDP per capita growth barely above 1% after a century or more of steady 2% plus growth. So as we look out, again, I keep seeing a difference between the US and Europe because of this new attitude in the United States that with low interest rates, you can essentially print money and spend on the part of the federal government, channeling some of that spending to the states and localities with abandon and leave aside the entire philosophy that was responsible for slow growth in the decade of the teens. So it remains to be seen how much of this pickup in demand that solves Larry Summers' problem is going to be reflected in faster productivity growth versus faster growth in employment. I think we're going to see a combination of both, partly because, as I think I'd like to coin a phrase, productivity is going to be dragged along as output is stimulated by government spending, whereas labor input is going to be held back through this phenomenon of women at home taking care of their kids. That's all by its very nature temporary, because surely the schools will be reopened and 2 years from now, things are going to look much more normal. But I think in the next 4 to 6 quarters, we may see quite unusual productivity gains due to this labor shortage aspect. And I'd like to hear what others think about that, particularly from the European point of view.
Yeah. Paul, do you want to jump in? What do you think about these long-term forces and then also the labor force issue that Bob has raised?
So some of the factors that have been mentioned as underlying causes are not going to go away very quickly. I mean, the population aging and the structure of the economy, the savings that are flowing from east to west, those are, I guess, going to be around for a while. But it does seem that the austerity measures that Bob was mentioning earlier in the US, that were also apparent in some parts of Europe, particularly the UK, had a bit of a drag effect on growth, and so those may go away. And although we're not having the same level of stimulus in Europe as you will have in the US, the likely spillovers from the US to Europe are going to still have a very positive effect, I would say.
So,
Jan or Rob, do you want to get in on this?
yeah, I think there's sort of 3 big ways to think about investment lag or decline or stagnation. There's sort of the Keynesian view, which we've been talking a little bit about here. If we expand overall demand, investment will go up. Yeah, sure, but only to the extent that we expand. If demand goes up 5%, investment should go up 5%. I don't think that's what was causing the problem in the post Great Recession period. The second is more kind of traditional neoclassical economist view, which is a price response. So if we could lower interest rates or allow accelerated depreciation, which, by the way, I support, that would spur demand for capital goods. I think what's missing in all of that is the actual change in the capital good. Companies buy new capital goods when capital goods become compelling. I remember for at least 15 years, I was buying a new computer every 2 years because the computer I had was out of date. And now the only reason I buy a new computer is if mine breaks, because they just aren't improving that fast. And so I think that's, to me, the critical question. Is there a suite of technologies going to be appearing that are so compelling that companies in a wide variety of industries feel that they have to buy it? And I think I'm kind of with Jan on this. I think there's a lot more. I would bet more on that in the next 5 years than I would in the last 5 years. I think there's some real possibilities of that.
Jan, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, and I might add also kind of on the structural focus forces, we actually looked also at what caused the productivity slowdown after this wonderful mid-90s to mid-2000s period. And what we found was, on the one hand, that was really kind of the end of this massive PC-triggered acceleration, or ICT-driven acceleration in the mid-90s, together with a few other things that went along the same dimensions, like increased offshoring, increased automation in the factories at home, and so on, that kind of ebbed away. And together with the post-financial crisis world, even more so than before, suffering from this like sustained output gaps, weak demand. I think it was more a shortage of investment than an inflow of savings, honestly, if you just look at particular net investment rates to GDP. And then the next wave of digital technologies that we have been talking about for so long, not really kind of gaining steam, and all the kind of duplication of online versus offline channels and so on. And I'd be quite optimistic now, because that last point is now going away. We are now seeing kind of, we are at the end of those well-known technologies that is now kind of really adopting fast and delivering us productivity benefits. And on the demand side, in the US, it seems to get fixed at least for a few years via policy now, in Europe to be seen. And then it's still unclear what will happen like on a 5 to 10 year horizon on the demand side. I think that is for me is still a big uncertain part of the game.
So on the flip side, governments took on a lot of debt in response to the crisis. Should we worry? Obviously faster growth would make all that easier to pay down over time, but should we worry that this debt will weigh down growth and make it harder for policymakers to do the things needed to foster productivity growth? And at the same time, as you alluded, Bob, should we worry about inflation? With all of this stimulus coming into, particularly the U.S., our friend Larry Summers has warned about that as well. So I just like to hear the group's thoughts on the debt and inflation risks right now. Bob, do you want to start?
Yes. The channel goes from low inflation to low interest rates to fiscal space to raise the government debt, because the cost of servicing the debt is so low given the low interest rates. So it all hinges on the low level of inflation that makes the low interest rates possible. The Phillips curve that used to describe the relationship between unemployment and inflation has changed dramatically in the US. And this goes back 25 years. It's not just that the natural level of unemployment, the so-called NAIRU, the non-inflationary rate of unemployment, has fallen. But we saw in the great financial crisis that inflation hardly changed at all. Instead of collapsing in the wake of a high level of unemployment, as the Phillips curve would have predicted, inflation stayed relatively stable. So it appears that the long discussed role by macroeconomists of inflationary expectations has taken over from the Phillips curve, and suggests that as long as people are expecting inflation to be moderate. It will continue to be moderate. Now, there are some problems. We've got shortages of used and new cars. We've got problems of lack of supply in different areas. And I think we're going to see inflation rise over the next 2 years into the area of 2.5% from essentially what has been 1.5% for the last decade. But that's just minor. I don't see any kind of return to the 4, 5, 6, or even 10% inflation that we suffered from back in the 1970s and early 1980s. And those who think that that's going to return, I think are going to turn out to be wrong. So I'm looking for faster inflation, but at a very moderate pace by the standards of post-war history.
Well, okay, we all hope you're right. Paul, you're our other macroeconomist. How do you weigh in on this?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I think the two factors that are keeping inflation low, despite the effects that any stimulus plans are likely to have on raising inflation, there's the long run real equilibrium interest rate, which has been on a downward trend for 30 years and is extremely low, and I think that's going to ensure that interest rates remain low, inflation remains low. And the other factor is that expectations of inflation are incredibly well anchored. And this comes from the credibility that's been built up over a number of years since the Volcker period, really, when central banks committed themselves to price stability, and that's become embedded in people's expectations about inflation. Those two things, I think, will counter the short-term effects of the stimulus. And so with inflation low, I think interest rates will continue to remain low, which means it's possible to finance a lot of infrastructure spending and improvements.
All right, great. I think, I have many more questions I'd like to ask, but I think it's time to open it up to our audience now. If you want to ask a question, go to the event page and the Slido panel under the video, or go to the Slido panel. I'm sorry, the Slido link in the YouTube description. I hope I said that right. Let me say it again in case I got it wrong. To ask a question. Oh, no, I see some questions. I opened my panel and there it is. Okay, all right, let's get going then. And forgive me, I'm not going to read out the names of all the people asking questions because, I'd be afraid to mispronounce your name. So let's just start. Regarding the actions and policies needed to maintain the economy post-COVID, how can they at all, if at all, balance the need for environmental sustainability? Interesting. Okay, so does anyone on our panel want to take that one on? How do you balance the need for environmental stability with these things we're discussing to try our desire to generate growth, economic growth, and productivity growth?
I would like to suggest that the topic of environmental sustainability requires a different simultaneous policy track from the issues that we've been discussing of productivity growth. One of the things that policy can do is to speed up the transition to electric vehicles by subsidizing the spread of electric charging stations, for instance. Policy can speed up the transition to a cleaner environment by doing what the Biden administration is notably failing to do, and that is introducing a carbon tax, which is progressed somewhat further in Europe than it has in the US. So I think we need to talk about the environment in a separate topic box from the issues of raising productivity. A little bit more productivity or a little bit more GDP growth is going to have trivial effects on the environment compared to a massive transition to electric vehicles.
I might add there is maybe a certain intersection in the sense that we do need a little bit of the demand boost now to get the economy going and keep it going. And sustainability investments are one of the most obvious points where you actually can put more money in, where you can invest, and where you can also put good money in. There's always a question on how well you spend your money. So there might actually be a little bit of a link there, and that for me also goes a little bit back to the question on debt sustainability, where there might be a little bit of a discussion to be had. If you want all this stimulus, do you have to do it all via the public purse and raising your debt? Whether that's sustainable or not, I'll leave to the macroeconomists. Or could you also do it instead, for instance, as Bob was saying, by raising carbon taxes or raising standards, and this way getting the private sector to invest?
Rob, did you want to weigh in on this? I think it's one thing to say we should be making investments in sustainable technologies, but does that necessarily raise productivity, or are those two separate issues?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jan. The idea somehow that, or Bob, that somehow if we raise productivity a percentage point, that has going to have negative effects on the climate. Look, the rest of the world is going to grow so much more than that in terms of output and population. It's a drop in the bucket. I think the more important question is, as we think about some kind of infrastructure package, are we putting enough money? First of all, I 100% agree. This is, to me, one of the problems of the Biden package is there's no carbon tax in it. I would pay for a lot of this with a carbon tax. But even a carbon tax alone is not enough. We need electric vehicles right now, for example, are not ready for prime time. Most Americans will not buy an electric vehicle, even if you subsidize it. We need better batteries. I mean, they're getting there. Don't get me wrong. Solar, wind, all of these technologies are getting there, but they're not good enough yet. And if anything, we can get better technologies for clean energy. That's really what we need. If we try to push technologies that aren't ready yet, we're going to lower labor productivity because if the technology costs more, by definition, you're going to lower labor productivity. I don't think we're going to need to make that choice, though, if we can continue to invest in R&D and other kinds of technology development.
Okay. Anybody else wanted to? I guess we pretty much covered that. Let's go to the next one. Someone asks, many suggest a COVID-induced rise in productivity in service sectors. Oh, I see. With high shares of services in modern economies, why do we care about manufacturing? That's a good question. I mean, anyone want to take that one on? Why should we care about manufacturing?
I think there are really two questions. One is, does a modern economy in the United States or or Europe in general need manufacturing, or should we just leave it all to the Asians? And there it's a matter of jobs, sustainability of local communities, and the balance between pure globalization and the enormous costs that are imposed on communities and workers when manufacturing shuts down. So there's the sort of welfare issue of whether you want a manufacturing sector at all. But on the side of productivity, I think it's just an intellectual challenge to try to figure out why the manufacturing sector would have had such an incredibly different productivity experience in the late 90s and early 2000s than it's had over the last decade, given the fact that personal computers and the innovations we've been talking about that happened back in the 90s aren't particularly important in manufacturing. And the issue of why the robots aren't having a bigger effect is also, I think, a live topic. So it's an intellectual challenge on the productivity side, and it's a welfare issue on the globalization and offshoring side.
See, I guess I'd have a little bit different view. If we do not have a vibrant, I mean, if you want to know what happens when you don't have a good manufacturing sector, move to the UK and they'll tell you. That's why the government is trying to get one back. If we lose our manufacturing sector, which, by the way, we have been, when you measure output, when you control for BEA mismeasurement, which is rampant, our manufacturing output is down about 11% over the last decade. That's unprecedented. The real issue, though, is if we have a weak manufacturing sector, by definition, we're not going to be able to have a trade balance. Most of our we can never export enough services to make up for our manufacturing exports. And therefore, ultimately, the dollar will decline dramatically at some point. I don't want to live in a world where the dollar is all that low, because every time I go to France or Canada, or Mexico, I'm going to pay an enormous amount of money. The second big reason, which we can't underestimate, is national security. We can, if the U.S. wants to have any kind of defense base that is equal to or superior to the Chinese, we have to have a strong manufacturing sector. That's why, for example, Congress is hoping going to fund the CHIPS Act to restore chip production here.
Well, and I would add that one of the things I think we've seen that was very interesting during the pandemic is sort of an expanded definition of national security to include medical products. You know, there are a lot of countries that are struggling with the fact that they don't manufacture vaccines, they don't manufacture ventilators. You know, we had a shortage of those. And also, you know, we're seeing this shortage of chips, which the Wall Street Journal has a great story on this, explaining part of what happened was you've got smart chips and so-called dumb chips. And U.S. manufacturers are making more of the smart chips because they're more profitable, but it turns out we need a lot more of the dumb chips, and as a result, our automotive sector is screwed up right now. But anyone else wanted to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I'd like to just say that I think the focus has to be on high value added activities, not just whether it's in manufacturing or services. So there are low productivity areas of manufacturing, there are low productivity areas of services. One of the strange things around the COVID experience has been that the least productive parts of the economy have been most hard hit, which has meant that productivity has risen. So I think there is a lot of scope for certain areas of manufacturing where there's high value added, for that to be a part of the mix in trying to raise productivity in different countries, and equally offering those services, those premium services that have high productivity, and a lot of the other stuff which is less productive perhaps can be that isn't necessarily something that needs to be done in every economy. Those services can be acquired from elsewhere.
All right, let's move on to the next one. It looks like Europe is ahead in public infrastructure and economic recovery investment. Will that have an impact on EU productivity compared to the US? Why don't we start, Paul, is that true?
So we just left the EU, so I don't know so much about
that
particular question.
Forget that.
Maybe Jan knows.
Yeah, Jan, you're still in Europe. What do you think?
I would need to check the numbers whether that is really the case. Huh? I think there are some pretty big packages in the US also discussed. Of course, the fact that infrastructure in Europe is fairly good is helpful, but given that this kind of revolution ahead is mostly a digital one, what matters now most is digital infrastructure. And of course, in fiber to the home connections, Europe is unfortunately not ahead. It's lagging.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? Whether you're in or out of the EU? Or I'll go on to the next. This is a good question. It says, with increasing productivity, how do we make sure that emerging economies, as well as low-skilled workers at home, are not more marginalized? Jan, do you want to tackle that? I know you addressed some of that in the report.
Yeah, we have a separate piece of research also just out a few weeks ago on the future of work and what the crisis does to the future of work. And there are kind of estimates are that also the shift or the transition needed both across sectors, but also across kind of tasks and skills will also massively accelerate because of the crisis. So many of the lower skilled jobs may not come back in the same form. Many of the new jobs that are required, that are out there, require more skills, more emotional, more social, more digital skills. So this is a massive transition challenge that we all collectively need to meet. Firms, workers, the public sector, the education sector, all combined.
Let me just add, I think the public...
I think this morning, this is going to have to be our last question. So please, each of you, if you want to weigh in, let's do it now. And any other last wrapping up thoughts you want to add? Rob, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just say the public debate on this issue to me is very misleading because why do we have so many low-wage jobs in the U.S.? Because we've created so many low-wage jobs. That's the reason. Now, we support a higher minimum wage. That would help, but it can't solve the problem fundamentally. And so automating low-wage jobs is actually quite a progressive goal. It is a way for the economy to shift into having more middle wage jobs. And as long as we provide the right training and retraining for workers, I think we're going to be a lot better off. Workers will be a lot better off. Right now, it's just hard to raise wages in low productivity sectors, low productivity occupations, because they don't produce enough. So if we can automate those jobs, we're going to, by definition, get middle wage jobs in response.
Paul, do you have any closing thoughts on this or anything else?
Absolutely. So I think, education and training in IT is going to be a critical thing to equip our workforce for those kinds of roles. And in a digital economy, that's going to be important. Particularly, we've been fortunate actually that during COVID that we haven't had huge amounts of scarring that are going to remain, because the policies have kind of provided that bridge from one side of the COVID experience to the other. And hopefully, as the economy shifts, people will be able to move over to the more digital sector, but we still need to provide retraining and education. I think also the infrastructure that supports that. And one of the areas, incidentally, I mean, I know the question was about emerging markets and sort of inequalities and so on, but actually the young people have been disproportionately affected by COVID and the impact of COVID. So we need to think about how to make sure that people with relatively little experience get into the workforce and have jobs.
Yeah, very good point. And Bob, do you want to give us a closing thought on this?
Yes, just a closing thought on Rob's suggestion that what we need is to automate the low skill, low wage jobs. We have that going on as we speak in the transition from retail trade to e-commerce. And what we've had is a massive displacement of retail workers by warehouse workers, putting all those Amazon goods into packages. Is that an improvement? Amazon pays $15 an hour. So from that point of view, we are seeing the kind of transition that Rob is advocating.
All right, I think that's it. I'm sorry, but it looks like that's all the time we have for today. So let me wrap up by saying thank you so much to the ITIF for hosting this great event. And thanks so much to each of our panelists for your time and your thoughts. This has really been a pleasure and honor for me. And thanks to our audience for joining us and participating. And if you want to rewatch or share this event, a recording of the conversation will be available on YouTube and the ITIF website. So with that, I'll just say goodbye and have a great day, everyone. Be productive.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.